That one?
Yeah.
Okay. Theo, you can go ahead and start.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen on Business Links Africa. Thanks for dialing in today. We're live on, and with me today is Gail Klintworth. We're talking about sustainability, business sustainability issues in Africa. It's a very good evening today. I'm excited about this session because we are mainly dealing with businesses in Africa, business growth, business development, and that's what we stand for. So, welcome, Gail.
Thank you, Theo. Good to be here and to meet the honorables online.
Yes, good to meet all the honorables online. Can you, Gail, just so that we can start off, can you tell us a little bit about you so that people get to know who you are, the business that you run, and how well you're doing so far?
Okay, so great, everyone. I have a very interesting history. I think you can hear that I am South African. I worked with Unilever for 28 years. I used to run the Unilever operations in SADC. Then I ran the Unilever Global Savory business, the Unilever Global Laundry business. Then I became Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever globally. And I then moved to Old Mutual, where I was on the Old Mutual board. And then I decided that I would really give it one last shot before I hang up my boots and retire, to help drive the kind of change that I believe is necessary in the world, largely through business delivering positive impacts. So I am a partner in a small startup business called Systemic. We are focused on systemic change. So how do we change systems around the world, focused largely on energy, land use, and circular materials, always with a social impact. And I was telling Theo earlier, we kind of operate at three levels. We convene large global coalitions, one, the Business Commission, which I'll talk about, the Energy Transition Commission, the International Resource Panel, etc., where we have some of our thought leader partners involved in running these. And then we operate projects on the ground that are about scaling sustainable business solutions to challenges. So we work in Indonesia, Malaysia, pieces of Africa, and I can talk about one project in particular, in Europe, and more recently in Latin America. And then we have a very small venture capital component that's investing in a few what we consider to be kind of global game-changing technologies. One of them I can mention is biocarbon, drone planting of trees, which is a new startup that has learned how to plant trees in peatland in Indonesia by dropping it with drones, and it grows, which obviously obviates the need for individuals to go out and plant all these trees, which won't happen. That's it. Oh. And how are we doing? I think pretty good.
Yeah. We're doing quite well. One of the things that, sorry to jump in straight after your telling us about your business and how it goes, and it's exactly what we actually wanted most of the viewers, and the reason being because the first question that we have, which will tell you a lot about the thoughts about the people, is what are the sustainable development goals and how they affect and or develop businesses?
Great. Okay, thanks, Theo. So I think many of you have probably heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the global goals, as we try to refer to them. And they are a UN agenda, 17 goals that we believe will help to shape the future of the economy and the development agenda in the world. And these 17 goals range from number 1 says no more poverty, to number 17 that says we have to work in partnerships to solve things, number 11 that talks about sustainable production and consumption, and in between that, everything else. The reason I got involved in the Sustainable Development Goals is that in fact, one of my ex-bosses was one of the conveners of this Business and Sustainable Development Commission that was really focused on bringing businesses together to think about what the business opportunities are and how business can drive this agenda, so that it is no longer a development agenda run by, I guess, civil society and governments, but business needs to be part of the solution. And so the work that we did was to help quantify the opportunities for investment and for businesses in order for the SDGs to be achieved. And it addressed, I guess, the transition needed. So, for example, renewable energy is the most critical scaling opportunity for us to address some of the climate issues and, quite frankly, to address a lot of the lack of access to energy around the world. And so renewables is a significant investment opportunity. Everyone knew that. But then there are less likely suspects, such as the investment in aquaculture. So for many industries around the world that are based in the fishing communities, we know that in order for people to move from just very large trawlers catching fish that are depleting the oceans to still be able to produce fish to feed and fish food to feed, we need to scale up aquaculture. So really across the range, an opportunity of $12 trillion globally has been identified for businesses to invest in and take hold of opportunities to drive the SDGs. And the great thing about that is that we've also quantified that there are 380 million jobs that could be created through this. And I'll talk a little bit later about the opportunity in Africa, but globally, that's the opportunity. And really what I did for 2 years is run around the world trying to get more and more businesses to understand this opportunity and to either, if they're big corporates, think about SDGs in their business agenda, and if they're entrepreneurs, really understand that they've got a critical role to play in helping the transition happen. And if they're investors, or big financial institutions, think about the investment thesis and whether they are in fact taking hold of the future we want to create or whether they're still stuck in the past, what made the economy work before.
Oh, brilliant. So talking about this funding, which is quite a huge amount of money, how do businesses qualify for the funding? What's the criteria?
Okay, so it's not funding here. So this is really the size of the opportunity if business accesses it. So the funding out there is really much the same as funding's always been. So it's funding through the banks, it's funding through donor agencies, it's funding through the SDG goals. Our remit was not about donor funding. Our remit was to talk about the enterprise and investment opportunities out there. Now, of course, if people come up with a grand idea, there are various funds now that are being driven through some donor agencies. So there's an SDG fund, the World Bank has got an SDG fund, and there are a lot of venture capital impact type firms that have funding available. But that wasn't the purpose. So the 28 trillion, the 12 trillion is just really what the big opportunity is to drive growth in the right way. And let me just add one more thing. There was obviously a large, so goal number 5 is around gender equality. And all of the research that we've done has shown that encouraging women to participate equally in the economy across the world adds another 28 trillion to the 12 trillion. So there again, you know, there are loads and loads of funds out there targeting women-owned businesses and women participation in the economy.
Yeah, women. I mean, we try to encourage more women to join into businesses as well. For some reason, I think women are better savers than men, financial savers in terms of, because you're looking at across Africa, you find that there's lots of small businesses which are being run by women, and they seem to sustain themselves for longer periods in terms of, you know, as compared to what generally is available, or what generally is other businesses that have been done, for example, in the markets and market stalls and all that. Yeah. So
just on that, so in the DECA Centre Cross, if anyone ever looks at it, I've put the link into the Business Commission site.
Okay.
On that, you will see all the reports. So there were reports done about this 12 trillion opportunity globally. Then there was one done for every single region in the world. The very short Africa one, I also sent across. But there's also a report on women driving the global goals. And in there, there's, you know, this was a very large research study. There's a whole lot of facts there that can be quoted around the impact of women in business in driving the global goals, including what you just mentioned, which is very often the businesses tend to be pretty successful. And in fact, if you take risk management, very often, even in the big companies, having at least 2 women involved in your executive team seems to have a significant impact on the long-term sustainability of your business.
Oh, great. So in terms of SDGs, how can SDGs help businesses in Africa?
All right. So, I mean, I don't need to tell anyone on this call that many of the issues that SDGs seek to address are most acute in Africa. So poverty, hunger, lack of education, water issues, waste issues, degrading agriculture, poor energy solutions, and lots of jobs not there for young people that need them. So the SDGs really are a framework to think about the kind of future that we need. We need everywhere in the world, but also in Africa. So they tried, really the SDG idea was, and it was for the first time that it was governments and civil society and businesses that agreed this, right? Now, agreeing and doing anything about it, of course, are 2 different things, as we all know. It was the first framework. In Africa, we calculated, so if I said 12 trillion business opportunity out there globally, in Africa, we calculated $1.1 trillion US, not available for funding, as an market opportunity, if you get your act together, that you can begin to drive for the private sector linked to the SDGs. And the number of jobs that can be provided through that in Africa is around 85 million jobs. Now, I can't, and I know that, you know, most of the interest on this call will be around Ghana. I can't break that down for Ghana in particular. I was trying to do that, but we didn't have the granularity of the data there. But for Africa, that's pretty cool. And I would imagine that every single country in Africa, if you look at the sorts of opportunities that we have identified as necessary, if we're going to solve for the SDGs, a lot of it will make sense to you. So, for example, if I have a look at the biggest opportunity in Africa across the board is risk pooling, right? So risk pooling in terms of insurance and healthcare. Why? Because most people in Africa, individuals and many businesses, do not have access to insurance. And I can talk to you about that coming from Old Virtual, obviously, right? And there are many reasons for that. Partly it's because it's very difficult to underwrite individuals and small businesses. Secondly, people don't really understand enough about insurance. Thirdly, the cost of taking premiums is often out of the scope of individuals. However, so necessary, because insurance, as we know, is the most critical safeguard that if something happens, so you have a small crop, there's a drought, your crop fails, what do? You take your kid out of school, right? Whereas if you can provide a very small solution for example, smallholder insurance for crop failure, then it really does help as a safeguard. The risk pooling is one of the biggest opportunities. The second opportunity is affordable housing. So across Africa, housing is a significant issue, and people, who are moving to urban areas are struggling to figure out what kind of housing they can get hold of. And again, what we tried to do in a lot of the work that we've done is get examples from other parts of the world of how they managed to solve for this problem. And so we, for example, we explained how Singapore set up a particular fund to crowd in affordable housing, to get private suppliers to begin to think about how they could make affordable housing profitable for themselves. And in fact, Modi has just done the same in India. So he has put in various incentives to ensure that not only do people go and build big fancy hotels in Mumbai, but actually developments around affordable housing. So so yes, the opportunity in Africa is significant in there. The SDGs is a framework to think about these opportunities. And in fact, we believe strongly, and I'd say everywhere in the world, but I particularly think in Africa, Asia, businesses are going to drive these solutions, because we know that a lot of the broader, I guess, public sector solutions are often failing.
All right. This is actually falling to the third question that I have. Because what I was going to ask, which is the third question that we had from our panel of members, was what's your understanding of emerging markets and how can businesses get involved in these markets? Okay.
So I've tried to answer that by basically saying, so why would any business want to get involved? So I don't know if it's a big business or small business you're talking about, but I can talk from a big business perspective. At the end of the day, the population and youth are sitting in emerging markets, right? So clearly all of my life in Unilever was about how we drive growth in emerging markets. That being said, emerging markets are, as we all know, pretty risky, right? I always used to have a good laugh when I was running. I mean, it sounds terrible to a good laugh, but you have to laugh sometimes because otherwise you cry, right? I used to laugh sometimes when I was involved in running both Africa and Asia in Unilever. We'd take bets on which country was going to have a major problem, right? And we tried to figure out who was going to be able to bail them out.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, things are just not stable. So why do companies or business get involved in emerging markets? Because that's hopefully where the growth will be. And consistently, if you have a look at, and I'll talk about it later, if you have a look at the MSCI Emerging Markets Index, it outperforms in percentage terms the rest. Okay. However, we also know that because of these constant failures, you can't just rely on the really big market mechanisms. And so, it's very interesting because I was talking to a young man on Friday who comes from Kenya, and he is working on building a business where he gets local farmers to plant trees on their smallholder plots. He teaches them how to do it in the way that it'll be the best yield and with the right seedlings, so that they get these long, straight trees that can be used for fence poles, right? And then he's got a market mechanism that then collects these trees after 7 years. The farmers get paid for their trees, and he sells it to these construction groups that are putting fencing around. So that's really cool. Now, the interesting thing, this guy comes from California. So I say to him, well, what on earth are you doing in Kigali in Kenya with this business? And he said, I'm there because you can actually do things. He said, the problem sitting in many parts of the world that is so developed is that it's really hard to get things done and be an entrepreneur. You either need to be a really grand digital unicorn startup, or you don't really have much of a chance. With emerging markets really does give us the opportunity to be entrepreneurs.
So what's a typical emerging market in Africa?
Well, if we take the again the MSCI definition, right? They divide up emerging markets, which include, interestingly, countries like Indonesia, China, etc.
Yeah.
Then frontier markets, which are those that aren't quite there in terms of size, scale, and business readiness. And those include countries like Bangladesh. And then finally, and I was interested to see this from Ghana's perspective, then there are what are called standalone markets, right? And these are countries that, have potential, but they've had some problem, quite frankly. They're either too small that they haven't been able to scale up, or they've had some kind of political difficulty, and the markets just feel that they are not, stable enough as a business environment to put them into a broader index.
So if we're talking about emerging markets, is it like on an international scale, or is it a continental, or countrywide or something like that?
So they're okay. So emerging markets in the stock definition has got very clear definitions. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. So, I'd encourage anyone that wants to have a look at this, go and have a look at the MSCI definitions, which change all the time depending on the stability and the size of the economy. Emerging markets in I guess my consideration, having worked in consumer markets and financial markets, are ones where there's really an opportunity for significant growth, because it hasn't yet developed to the point where everybody has everything they need. And now so that, I would like to think about emerging markets like that. And it's a really interesting, it's an interesting phrase, right? Because if you start thinking about solutions for old people, right, you could say that in those terms, China's now an emerging market for the aged, right? Whereas Japan's a developed market for the aged. So yes, but I think in our context, we're basically I use the MSCI index definitions.
Oh, okay, brilliant. So, and in terms of scaling or descaling, these in terms of in Africa, what would you say is an emerging product or business or that can be marketed, for example?
Okay, gosh. Well, the great thing is everything, right? So everything. So if we look at again, I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about all of my experience. Infrastructure, desperate need. So anything involved with infrastructure, right? Bricks, planning, everything involved in infrastructure. Secondly, pretty much everything involved with how you do sustainable agriculture and how you ensure that the right kind of planting, the right kind of tending, and the right route access to market. That's a significant opportunity, because we have 60% of our 60% of our population is involved in some form of farming. Thirdly, anything digitally enabled, right? So if we have a look at everything from how do you provide access to financial services? So if I will obviously use the M-Pesa example, right, which was highly successful. If I have a look at a lot of the, even in the insurance for smallholder farmers is all around digitally enabled. But also, if you have a look at healthcare, so again, I encourage you to go onto the sites that I've provided. If you look around healthcare, one of the greatest solutions that we have now coming out in parts of East Africa is something called Doctors, right? Which is a digitally enabled link so that midwives can connect with hospitals and get the right kind of information they need when they're out in rural areas trying to help women. So, yeah, you know, I think it's just endless. That's why it's a continent of grand opportunity.
Yeah, that's it's interesting you mentioned that, because on the forum we have one of our senior surgical experts, Dr. Jack O'Donnell, who mentioned similarly using the you know, this Fitbit watches to be able to track. He's trying to create a system whereby we'll be able to use a similar system in terms of using the Fitbit watches to determine people's health conditions electronically. The reason being because, of course, we all know how difficult it is and how many doctors we have covering a particular area or community. So it's interesting you mentioned this about the nurses actually logging in as well, or being able to have access to a particular health system where they can actually train themselves, get information. And it's quite interesting you mentioned that. I'm going to raise that up with the health officials in Ghana. One of the things, again, that has come, or the next question, which is question number 4, is what is your forecast on emerging markets economies in 2018, 2019, and how does Ghana feature?
Okay, so I put a disclaimer in. I'm not an economist, right?
Yeah.
So I really am. I'm just going to quote just so that I can answer the question, right? So I was delighted actually to see that if I have a look at the World Bank now are forecasting global economic growth to edge up to about 3.1% in 2008, which is good. I hope it does actually last, as there's a little bit of recovery going on. Advanced economies are going to about 2.1%, right, which is pretty good. The great thing is that Ghana is now identified as probably for 2018 going to be one of the fastest growing economies. And the reason why it's identified is that, first of all, there's been a recovery in commodity prices, right, which is not always the best thing, because we know that many of our African economies are so tied to global commodity prices that they are, you know, we used to say in South Africa, basically, when the world sneezed, South Africa caught a cold, right? Because we were stuck in basically gold and agricultural commodities. And Ghana, with its large agricultural commodity exports, oil, I think is benefiting from a recovery in commodity prices. But the great thing that's also identified now is that not only is it the commodity price recovery that's helping Ghana, but it's the fact that you have started diversifying the economy. And so since your new president took place, and I don't know if we put it down to him or not, but there's been a lot more activity going on to really get the economy diversified. And we know in all African countries, that's the big issue, right? I mean, we have the same in Nigeria. Nigeria is just so dependent on the oil price. In fact, it's not only Africa. I do a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, right? The key Vision 2030 objective of the new Crown Prince is to diversify the economy. So for Ghana, assuming that nothing happens, you know, it looks like it's going to be a good year. And it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful if Ghana could move from being a standalone market to at least get into the frontier market index, because we see whenever that happens, we see that there is a significant improvement, at least a boost to the economy, because, you know, suddenly people start investing almost through passive funds in the economies.
Yeah, they're talking about the frontier. One of the discussions that we held on the forum, talking about buying local. Do you think that can help the economy as well?
Okay. So absolutely. So when you say buying local, where? You mean in Ghana, right?
Either in Ghana or within Africa.
Yeah.
Trading locally, basically.
Yeah. So that is the new president of the AU. That's his, I guess, big manifesto around this African economic union. And I'd encourage you to read about that, because I think that is really interesting. Which is, if we think about, if you just think about trade flows, so we are sending our stuff out. We're still, after goodness knows how many, 100 years, we're still sending all of our commodities out to be turned into some kind of value somewhere else, right? And then we buy it back, which is, absolutely ludicrous for any economy. All right, so I'm going to use the example of chocolate.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ghana, right? You grow, I think it's the third largest cacao agricultural commodity production in the world. Most of the value added doesn't happen in Ghana. It all goes off to, in fact, not even the grinding happens in Ghana, right? It all goes off. A lot of it goes to Europe or to America, gets turned into chocolate, and then guess what? You guys then buy the chocolate back from these companies, right? Now, it's not that easy, right? So if we talk about buy local, yes. But, we always grew up buying local, didn't we? So we bought local. I mean, where I grew up, right, what didn't I buy local? So probably, pens and pencils, calculators, Koki pens, right, would be imported. But all of our food was local. So, I grew up basically in a fairly small community where we would buy things that people produced around us. I think there's still a lot of that happening as we become more middle class and we aspire to things that are potentially not produced in Africa. That's where we start buying international, right? And ideally, we need to get to the point where we not only are part of global trade, but actually we're part of a local trade union ourselves. Why has that been difficult to achieve so far? So there's been lots of attempts. I'm sorry, I have to cough.
Yeah.
This is lovely living in different temperatures.
Yes.
Why has that been difficult so far? So my experience of working anywhere where you're trying to get different nations to work together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, is that it's difficult, right? It's just difficult because everyone's trying to look after themselves. And if you've had a trade relationship with someone outside of your particular group, you don't want to give up your trade relation just in case your neighbor doesn't actually live up to what he promised. And so it's sometimes very, very difficult to get these things moving. But that being said, and I'd encourage you to really have a look at President Kagame's vision, because I think there's something interesting there.
Yeah, Kagame is a very much talked about leader at the moment in Africa. He's brought a lot of changes in Rwanda. He's been firm with the economy, and there's quite a lot of good news coming from Rwanda, which is quite interesting, in a country that recently, or I wouldn't say so recently, but they had all these tribal wars. and it's changed it all over so quickly. It's very interesting and very inspiring.
Well, it's very interesting, and it's also, so I do work in Rwanda, right? And for me, one of the most interesting observations I have is that it's really quite difficult to find a group of Rwandan people who are not totally committed to building their country.
Mm.
I think they've been through so much strife, and it's very sad to say, but sometimes you just have to go through hell before you see that there has to be a different way. And so it's not only the way President Kagame is leading and who he's brought into his governance, but I think the whole country has become aligned behind. And he's got this vision, an amazing vision. So one of my partners actually is working with him on his 2050 vision for Rwanda becoming sort of the Singapore of Africa. Very interesting.
Really? Then I need to get you definitely into Ghana to come and help us all. The word sustainability, why that word? What is it? I mean, I still haven't got my head around it properly. What is the link between sustainability and business development? I mean, why that word?
Okay, I really wish that word never existed, Theo, because it just confuses people. So, I always say, I mean, you don't need to know my background, but the reason I went into business was because I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I was not able to participate in what I believed was important for development, right? So I went into business because that was the other option. I never knew there was something called sustainability. There was no word like that when I entered business. I just thought that's what you did, right? You produced goods in the right way that didn't destroy the environment, didn't use up all the resources, and you produced goods or services that would actually secure people, right? So that was what you did. Businesses hundreds of years ago. I mean, let me take financial services, right? So Old Mutual, who I worked with, they started as a mutual fund, which was a group of people coming together and saying, gosh, we've landed up in Cape Town. We have no way to get insurance. Let us pool our money and see if we can buy some kind of insurance so that if one of us falls down, the rest can help. Right? That's how it started. So businesses' contribution to society, whether it's socially or environmentally, and then in a way that drives the economy, is all that sustainability is about.
Oh, okay.
Right? Now, the fact that we have kind of separated it and we've said, okay, well, you know what, you've got business that drives economic benefits. And then most businesses say, oh, and then we've got a CSR department or whatever that drives sustainability. That separation is part of what needs to change.
Okay, because my understanding about sustainability being the word itself is how you can basically sustain a business for a longer period, or how you can use or finding more eco-friendly ways of starting a business. That was my understanding, basically. So I was a bit confused about that.
So it's that too. So I mean, the term sustainability is you'll last for a long time, right? And lasting for a long time means that the official definition of the word sustainability is economically viable in a way that doesn't deplete the planet and delivers to future prosperity of people.
Right. Okay. So it's the main theme, more or less, is a business that will take people into consideration and how it will benefit people in the long term.
Exactly. And including the planet.
Oh, okay. Brilliant.
Because we live on it.
Of course. That takes me to the fifth question, actually. Looking at the various business sectors in Africa, which business area sectors would you say need sustainable development?
Okay. And I'm sorry because oh, here we go. Okay, I was just going to say I don't think I sent you that question, but I have got the answer. That all businesses, right? And it's not only in Africa; it's everywhere. So all businesses. And why do I say that? Well, first of all, because if you have a look at the issues that we've got, are we getting feedback?
It sounds quite clear to me. Yeah.
Okay. So if you have a look at the issues we've got, and I'm going to just use a few of them. So we know that the decline in poverty in Africa has been slower than most other places in the world. Okay, and any business that is doing business in an environment where you are not addressing your poverty or your inequality issues is never going to survive, right? Because it won't sustain. Secondly, we know that we have lots and lots and lots and lots of young people. The 20 countries with the youngest populations in the world are all in Africa, right? We have to create jobs for people in Africa, right? Whatever they are. I mean, some of them can be, whatever they are. And I can use an example. Thirdly, we still have significant problems with food insecurity and malnourishment in Africa, not least because we are just not resilient. And as we move forward with weather-related changes, we're going to be less resilient if we aren't careful. And then, finally, if you have a look at kind of infrastructure development, we really have a problem because infrastructure doesn't necessarily enable businesses to perform very well. So, I can tell you my days of trying to move goods across Africa with Unilever, it's not that easy, right? Not that easy. Both your imports and your exports, and it's not that easy. So infrastructure is a very big issue. And then with Old Mutual, the broadband connectivity, etc., not that easy. So, all of those issues involve virtually every industry and virtually every element of, I guess, what the SDG delivery could be. And so I'd say all industries need sustainable development. There's no question. And if we have a look, I mentioned the sorts of business opportunities that entrepreneurs might think about. I spoke about risk pooling. So, how do we get insurance there? And there are lots of, I think this is one of the things that's quite interesting. There are lots of examples in other parts of the world that have already started to solve some of these things. We don't always need to invent things ourselves. And when I say other parts of the world, I'm not necessarily saying the West, right? But one of the things I'd encourage people to is look at what's out there, because if we talk about doctors, if we talk about your surgeon honorable, right? If you have a look at a lot of what's going on in India around digital healthcare, there are some really good solutions out there. So risk pooling and health, digital health, expansion of renewables. Again, if I look at Mkopa, if I have a look at, in fact, in Nigeria now, you've got Lumos, which has got the tie-up with MTN, which is driving out solar solutions that people can pay for using a pay-as-you-go system, so they get electric. Those are grand opportunities. If you look at rooftop solar, great opportunities. If you look at efficiency in buildings, so how do you make sure that you use less electricity? Again, a significant opportunity. One of the things that I have been quite interested in, so I'm not going to go to Ghana in particular now, but we will at some point. If you have a look at your issues with intermittent power, which is everywhere, so, South Africa experienced that. So what do people do, right? One of the things that I'm really interested in is most businesses now run on diesel generators, right?
Yeah.
So that's cool. But you don't only need a diesel generator. So, are bundled solutions possible with diesel generators and solar opportunities for small businesses, right? So all of these are really great opportunities that can drive sustainable development. And then the last thing I think, and lots of this, by the way, is in all the reports that I've sent you and that's available on the web.
Yeah.
There's a really big issue around waste. So not only the piles and piles of garbage that are going into landfill and leaking into the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So solutions around that are essential and significant. But also food waste. So I don't know the statistics for Ghana, but I do know that generally in emerging markets, most of the food is lost between the farm and before it gets to wherever it's going, because the supply chains are just not efficient enough for you to get your tomatoes to market, right? And they spoil before they get there. And so the cold storage, the storage, etc., really, really a problem. Again, solutions to that, real opportunities. So, if we start talking about sustainable development as a business opportunity, I think you could go mad.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that you've mentioned here that we take really for granted, and come to think about it now, it's small business, but it can grow really quickly because, of course, there's a dire need for them. Mentioning agricultural products, especially the perishable goods like tomatoes, and the storage and the transportation issues. Finally, I think it was today, we had a member of sending over pictures of first train that has actually been traveling across the country, and I found that really exciting because it's been a while, a very long while that we've been waiting for these things to happen, the infrastructure. Thanks again to the administration that are helping bring all these into reality. Whereas before, I think most of the problems that we have is management of the little businesses and the infrastructures that we have, how to sustain them, keep them going, reinvent the wheels and keep the wheels running.
It's quite interesting here. Let me just interrupt you. So I'm involved in London Business School, who have a business for impact division. And they did a study looking at what the single most significant intervention was for driving local economic growth in, and I can't remember where it was somewhere in Africa. And what they found was that it was a road.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as the road went down, all sorts of little businesses were created around it, and people suddenly had access to market for their goods.
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, we had a discussion with one of the members from World Bank, and we had one of the issues that he mentioned, which is why it's always good for us to have these discussions and sessions, because it opens you learn so much in such a short period. And one thing that he mentioned, which got me really surprised, was how to transport goods even within African countries. And the difficulties that we face, these transportational issues. So basically, that's going to lead me to the next question, which is question 6. I was going to ask, how can sustainable development goals help the economy of Ghana? I think we've touched on it, but if you want to go briefly.
Yeah, I think we've touched on it, so I'm not going to talk more about the opportunities.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to talk about is this idea of sustainable special economic zones, right? And it's an interesting. Well, I mean, we all know that to try and address everything across an economy in terms of infrastructure, in terms of governance, in terms of quality of management, in terms of logistics, is really hard unless you are already Singapore, right? And so very hard, which is why many, many countries, and I guess China more recently made it a success story, have identified certain geographical areas that they have created.
Okay.
Where they crowd in either industrial sectors, or now, in fact, a lot of them are becoming not industrial, so science parks, etc., where they try and set the conditions for either an interrelationship between various industries so that you can create clustering, or special incentives, so import duties, export duties, better governance, etc., etc. Now, if you have a look at special economic zones in Africa, and I think there are 3 very active ones in Ghana. So I think Tema Port is one of them. I don't know what the others are. Very often, they haven't always been universally successful, and that is because I think they're seen as an easy solution to drive economic development, bring in FDI, and that's not really the case. You have to have, a good business reason for it. Secondly, very often, and not only in Africa, but very often, they have become areas where, either officials give it to their brother, or there's not the right kind of governance in place, or in fact, some of them around the world have been used for money laundering, right, because of the tax benefits. So that's one of the reasons. But thirdly, one of the big reasons is they haven't always given back to the local economy. Right? And so it's only when, generally, the research has shown that when special economic zones, they are generally as successful as their local economy is, and where they are linked into the local economy, they act as a catalyst, a catalyst for greater growth. So I'm going to use this example. I'm working in Nigeria with a private owner of a special economic zone, who currently services the oil and gas industry with ship fabrication. And we are helping this person transform their zone, or develop the rest of their zone, to be a deliverer of sustainable development in an economically viable way. And I'll give you an example. Some of the industries that we are looking at this person extending on their zone is to bring in, for example, a large coding university that teaches young people to come and get jobs coding virtually for some of the big global players. A sustainable fabric hub, because there's a growing need for sustainable fabrics as opposed to just the cheap and nasty stuff that depletes the environment and uses sweatshops. Potentially agro-processing, which I think is where some of your Ghanaian focus has been. And what's the benefit of that? Well, very often packaging is imported. And so if your packaging can come in to a zone where you are import duty free, you then add value through packaging your local produce, and then you can return it into the local economy or export, depending on what it is that you've got. Theoretically, it makes huge economic sense. So I'm particularly interested in this whole idea of taking special economic zones, free zones, whatever they are, and turning them into significant deliverables for sustainable development. And my experience was that as I helped Unilever set up, I didn't build it myself, but conceptually set up a large green industrial site in North China. And if you have a look at now, interestingly, not that one, but now interestingly, one, probably the most successful case in China, which is Shenzhen, Free Economic Zone, is now turning into a center for China's AI activities. So it's moved from industrialization to encouraging artificial intelligence, data analytics, etc., etc. So I think there's something there that's really interesting for all countries to look at.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you about the diversification issues, which is quite a good topic to talk about. But I think maybe that for another day, so because it's so broad, there's so much to talk about it. And I'm glad that you mentioned again that Ghana is currently one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, because it's got those opportunities to be a bit it's diverting from being just dependent on oil or cocoa, but into different other business areas. It's quite good to see that. In terms of this brings us to question 7 from the panel. So in terms of Africa, which African countries are currently participating in the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, so I was trying to look at the list. I think all are, because basically all UN aligned countries, and I think virtually all countries in Africa are. For me, the issue is that very few economies are driving the SDGs as an economic imperative. And what I've seen, not only in Africa, in other places too. So, I'm very involved in Sri Lanka. I've seen what's happened is it's become a government agenda. What the government have done is they've then put a person in charge. It generally goes into the statistics office. The statistics office starts now collecting data to prove how and it just isn't part of driving the economy, right? So I would imagine, from what I can see, virtually every country in Africa is taking that approach, and that's missing a big opportunity. Now, I don't know what the position is in Ghana. I tried to have a look. I think there's a site on Ghana and the SDGs, etc. But I certainly can't see a significant engagement of business and policy trying to drive the achievement. I can't see that on the web. It might be there on the ground. I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's so many opportunities there. Looking at it from outside the box or outside the country and looking into the country, we hear so much about business opportunities. It's a good place to be, the best place to be in Africa. What we've got to think about now is how to connect with Africa, which leads me to question 8. Looking at the current economic climate in Africa, which businesses would you recommend for startups, for example?
Okay, so I think I've kind of mentioned this beforehand, right? So look, I think there are a couple of issues, and I think we've got this not only, by the way, with I call it the diaspora, and whether it's the African diaspora or I deal with people who for whatever reason, left Pakistan. And now Pakistan's more stable. They're trying to figure out what they do. They would like to go back and contribute. Where do you get involved? What happens? You've been out for a long time. The guys that stayed there now have the big pickings or whatever it is. So, I think it's a common issue for people who have moved outside of their country. I can't specify. I think it all depends on, how much capital you have, how close your linkages are to the market, etc. What I do know is that in Africa, we need to leapfrog this whole industrial revolution. Okay, so at the end of the day, this has been, I guess, my mantra for the last 15 years. All countries in Africa cannot go through the same curve of growth that China went through, where they poisoned all their soil, destroyed all their water. It's just not, it's stupid, if you'll excuse me using that word, right?
No, it's funny you mentioned that, actually, because did that really happen in China?
Yeah.
What happened? I mean, if you say poison the water and the land.
So industrialization without consideration for the environment. Okay, so you grow more and more and more crops by doing what? By throwing on more and more fertilizer and spraying more pesticide. The problem is it doesn't last forever, right? Because your soil doesn't like it. And so eventually you land up with soil that is really not able to host your agricultural projects. Water, so I mean, in China, you've got very different water conditions, right? If you have unbridled industrialization where you don't look after the quality of your water, in the end, you're going to have rivers that you can't drink from.
Right.
That you can't use to irrigate your crops.
Well, the reason why I asked that is because we've got a similar situation in Ghana where there's been a lot of mining happening in the rural areas. We have all these Chinese coming in and a lot of foreign businesses that have started basically digging up everywhere. And there's a lot of concern in terms of the soil and the rivers, the streams that run in those rural areas. Because, of course, they're damaging them with all the chemicals like you're mentioning. That's what drew my attention for this question.
Yeah, so exactly right. Now, if we look, so what can you do about that? So first of all, I mean, you have to have environmental protection laws in place. So whether it's the environmental impact study, whether it's and that has to be done by the government, right? Because if they don't do that, unfortunately, capitalism has a really bad side. And that bad side is people who want to make as much money as quickly as possible, regardless of what they say in their CSR reports. And so, and it's not only foreign companies, by the way. So basically, unfettered capitalists can wreak great havoc.
Yeah.
What I would encourage one to think about is what sorts of solutions are needed, right? So I mean, it's quite interesting if you have a look, again, I'm going to use China. So if you have a look at some of the really great industries that have been sparked through air pollution, for example, you now have these apps so that you can see how much air pollution there is.
Yes.
And that can become monetizable, right? There are so water testing and treatment solutions. Okay, again, really significant. Soil test. Now, a lot of these, one would say it's really only the big international businesses that can drive these solutions, but not always, right? So much the same as doctors with midwives being able to, was actually a startup founded in Africa to solve Africa's problems. Much the same, we need to think about what it is in your rural areas that is going to help people address this problem.
Right.
And that's where I would really encourage, anyone that is sitting. Look, I don't want to become philosophical here or pretend that I know the answers. But I do have a belief that people who are closest to the problem very often know how to solve it. What they don't always have is access to either the latest technology or the funding to help them solve it. And so, I would encourage, and that's why, I work with a really great venture capitalist, impact venture capitalist,
yes,
who was founded in India, but he now also works in East Africa, called Avishkar VC. And he funds small startup enterprises that largely have some kind of a positive impact in society, but they have to have a sound business model.
Right.
And then he also runs separately to that I guess, consulting support arm to help them scale. Now he's, it's really interesting. I mean, he's just raised a $95 million fund for SDG impact, right? That he's now dispensing to these entrepreneurs. I'm not saying that's necessarily a route in, but what he does is he goes and he's got people working on the ground, figuring out what needs to be done. And very often, those people know, they just don't always have the solutions. And I wonder if that isn't something that people who care about the country from outside can help create connections to.
Yeah, you've given us quite a few business ideas from the conversations that we've had today. I mean, a typical example is what you mentioned about cocoa, that we are exporting the raw cocoas and it's going to be refined elsewhere, even crushing them into cocoa, whether it's a powder or the liquid format. We don't even do that in Ghana. We do
some of it, but not all of it.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of business issues here that we can tackle ourselves locally, and hopefully turn them into like finished products. Again, you mentioned about these perishable goods, tomatoes, food products that can be stored safely and then transported into various areas, markets that can be sold. There's quite a lot of business ideas out here, which I'm glad that we've been talking about, because you would never have thought about these things had it not been the fact that, and it's on a large scale as well, isn't it, Gail?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's on a large scale. So this leads us to the 9th question. This question I'm a bit, because I know you probably haven't focused on it because it's not been a business area, but it's a big topic in Ghana at the moment, because this topic is what our government is driving in Ghana, and it's to do with the one district, one factory issue. It's actually a question that I put in personally. The reason being because I just wanted you to highlight a bit of the areas that can be useful, can be helpful, and areas that we probably haven't even thought about that can, and also in terms of what you've just mentioned, venture capitalists that can, areas that we can put proposals through to attract funding, because this is a huge area. Now, the question is, with the current Ghanaian government's agenda for one district, one factory, what's your thoughts about it?
Okay, so I haven't actually posted a response to that, but I'll talk about it and maybe someone can capture it. So I didn't know about this until you raised the question. So I went in and I did a bit of web searching, right? So from what I can see, it really is an attempt to spread economic development beyond the urban centres.
Yes.
And which I think is fantastic. I mean, I worked for a long time on what we call the poverty nodes in South Africa, and we managed to get some movement, but not a hell of a lot. And I think it's a really great idea.
Yeah.
From what I can see, there are 248 or something of these identified.
Yes.
I think 7 have been awarded. I could only find examples on 2. One was around agro processing. I don't know what the other one was around. From what I can see, the idea is that you identify a raw material in the district, and you identify a customer, right? And the raw material, I guess, doesn't always need to be a commodity. Raw material could be, I don't know, a bunch of very bright kids.
Yeah.
It could do coding. It could be whatever. And it's really all about trying to stimulate local economic delivery. So I don't know enough about what each of the districts have as their special sauce, I guess we'd call it, that they can put into baking what would I call it, a super stew. But I guess that is what you guys need to think about. My only question about the one factory, one district, or one district, one factory, is the thought that is it one, right? Because my experience in looking at how you really drive economic development is that very often you need a clustering. And that's where these special economic zones came from. So the idea that you can't just have one, I mean, I'll give you an example, right? So I work in, so I advise a board in Sri Lanka that is an amazing business. They are garment manufacturers and people like Nike, Lululemon, etc. are their key customers. And they have a very strong sustainable business mission, right? So in fact, the founders, it's a private business, the founders of this business really, not only do they want to kind of make money, but their big thing is being able to create jobs and preserve Sri Lanka. Now they've branched out all around the world. So they're in 60 countries, actually. But so in Sri Lanka, in the north of Sri Lanka, some of you may be aware, is where all of the war took place. And so it was completely devoid of any. What the government did was encouraged industries to go and set up in the north in order to stimulate jobs, because we know that if people are, economically more prosperous, they're less likely to want to go to war, right? So they encourage that. So this company went and I mean, they are amazing. They set up a state-of-the-art factory for one of the big international brands. And they employ now something like 5,000 young women, and they train them on, they call it the Women Go Beyond program. They train them not only on how to, do all sorts of fancy stuff with fabrics, but they also train them on life skills, etc., etc. So it's really great. The problem there is that it's really only them that have gone there. So now you have, I think it's 5,000 young women employed, but the guys are all sitting at home, right?
Yeah.
That creates even bigger problems. The problem there also is that the water is really bad, okay? Not from the factory, but the water table is really bad. So it's really bad for agriculture. So what I'm encouraging them to think about is, okay, what can you bring in as a cluster around your factory? It's not them that they're going to have to work with the local development. What can you bring in around your factory so that you can create this, whatever services your factory needs or whatever you could service from your factory? Similarly, if the women are employed, what happens to the guys? So can you actually come in with an agro-processing company so that you have the guys employed, etc.? So there's, I think my only issue with the One District, One Factory is if they are thinking about it in as simplistically as put a factory in every district, that I just worry that it might be a little short-sighted, and it would be great to say, let's create a cluster. But maybe that's the intention, to catalyze something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a fair point that you raised out there. And talking about the water again, that brought another question into my mind about what happened in South Africa in terms of the water shortage.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So first of all, it's drought. Okay.
Yeah.
So and we can talk about climate change, global warming, etc. But you'll have seen everywhere in the world, including in Ghana, you now have severe variability in weather temperatures. Right? So you have very wet, you have flooding, and you have drought. Flooding, drought, flooding, drought. Okay? So that's the first thing. The second is really the management of the water table. So where you've built your dams, how you maintain everything, how you maintain the leakage from, whatever it might be, your pipes, etc., and how you ensure that that people use water responsibly. I think all of those are contributing factors to what, can you imagine Cape Town running out of water?
Well, yeah, because it was quite surprising. I mean, the population around there should be in millions, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
So the effect would be really devastating.
Yeah. But, the rains have come now. But now we've got this flooding, so... But this is it's really interesting, because when people talk about climate change and people talk about global warming, and they think about something like really far away.
Yeah.
Actually, what we don't realize is we're experiencing it now already, and because we haven't put in place adaptation mechanisms, we're going to be human beings are really funny creatures, aren't we? Even though people go, warning, warning, something's going to come, we just don't listen, and many of us don't listen until we fall over the stone.
That's right.
Then we think we better fix something, right?
Yeah, that happens, of course, most of the time, for something potentially dangerous to happen, and then, it rings a bell. That takes us to the 10th question, which is to do with basically the question when less than a decade ago, we had NEPAD, which is one of these institutions. What became of it, and was there any notable success?
Okay, great. So I was actually involved, not personally involved in NEPAD, but NEPAD was obviously one of the agencies that I worked with when I was running Unilever there. So I had to Google, because I've been out for a while, but I can tell you what I found, right?
Before you do that, Gail, can I ask a quick question? Because it seems to me Nepal, is it NEPAD?
NEPAD.
What is actually NEPAD?
Okay, so it was the New Alliance for Partnership for Africa. I can't remember exactly what the NEPAD stands for. Okay, and it was at that stage, it was Thabo Mbeki and President Obasanjo, who were like the two leaders that said, guess what? We need to get Africa working together, because if we do this, then we can create an African Renaissance. Right. So I think that was the grand dream. So what's happened over the decade? And it's more than a decade, by the way. So I think it was certainly pre-2020. I think it must have been about 2004 that it was envisaged.
Yeah.
So what's happened? Well, it's still operational. It has become an agency within the AU.
Okay.
When I have a look at everything that is written about it, and I looked up a couple of research papers this morning, actually. Basically, the view, I'm sure not from the people in NEPAD, but the view from the researchers outside, is there are two significant achievements. The one is the Africa peer review mechanism, which I don't know if you know about it, but was government leaders holding one another accountable for doing the right thing in terms of corruption and governance, etc. So at least there was a mechanism put in place, and they could go and, it's a bit like trying to say, instead of the IMF holding us to account, can we hold one another to account? So
talking about the IMF, we'll be coming over to that shortly.
Right. Okay. So that's the first thing. And the second example that is generally quoted as them being successful is the coordination of the fisheries sector, right? So because our waters are shared, right? So it's a global common. We really needed to have in place governance mechanisms around fisheries, but then also share best practice on what was working and make sure that what we would have in compliance mechanisms so that we could export our fish would be of the sufficient standard across the board. It is, from what I understand, this was something born out of Guinea, which then moved across many countries in Africa. So that's really good. What I hear that didn't work so well, like very many of our coordinating functions that we put in place, is that, change in leadership meant the new dudes didn't really like what the old dudes had put in place, so they wanted to do something different. People couldn't necessarily agree, and so NEPAD found it really hard to activate. And I was thinking about how what would I say about this? And I guess I wanted to use the same example of the EU Commission, right?
Okay.
So the African Union is going to have the same problems as the EU is going to have, which is, individual countries all wanting to, understand that being together is better, but actually sometimes we don't want to be together. And then if your main role is to actually make us all play together nicely and be so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, we might not always like what you're doing. So, I think there's that issue with NEPAD or the AU. And then finally, from what I can understand, the budget, about half came from international donors and half came from countries in Africa. And that hasn't necessarily continued to grow as they would like to for both reasons, right? So international donors putting in, thinking like, what are the outcomes, as well as local, thinking, what are the outcomes? So that's what I understand about NEPAD, but I hear Kagame saying it has to become our technical delivery agency for the AU.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay.
It leads to the AU again, questions about the AU. Basically, the next question, which is question 11, goes, the AU has some substantial development goals. Do they overlap with the UN's goals?
Yeah, completely. So the AU had sustainable development goals around their Vision 2063, right? I don't know why they chose 63. Yeah? Maybe it's 100 years after I was born. But so 2063 Vision had sustainable development goals. Those have now been linked to the SDGs. So if you go onto the AU website, there's a whole paper showing, how they link it. What I think the most important thing is about these goals is, in the end, any of these goals are frameworks to think about how together we work towards something different.
Right.
That's really what it's about. So, if you took the SDG goals as a compliance of all, it's going to be no different to any other goal, right? Because, the SDG goals are 17 big goals. There's 169 indicators. It's just a really complicated thing. Much the same as, the African Union's goals would also be whatever and become. I encourage particularly business to think about these goals simply as a framework for how you can think about driving growth that meets real needs. And if we do that, then I think those frameworks, whichever framework it is a good fit. And I think the UN SDG goals is really that. It's something that's trying to align governments, businesses, civil society to move towards solving some of the big issues we have in the world.
Great. One of the things that we just mentioned, but we didn't go into details, and it's a question that has come from the panel. So we need to go into it, and it's really interesting to know your thoughts on it as well. It's to do with the fact that there's been a lot of discussions about global warming and its impact causes economic damages, hurt human lives, health issues, influences the drives of human migration, which is a big issue, and it can jeopardize development for many of the world's poor. What are your thoughts about that, and suggestions and advice and anything that you have?
Okay. So my first thought about it is it's real. Okay.
All right.
Right. So if anyone is still questioning whether it's real, then you're living in Gugu Gaga land, right? And I would really encourage anyone that is in any way concerned about their kids or their grandkids, or in fact, if we look at the extreme weather events happening, just their communities, to really quite simply get your head around what's going on. And what's going on is that greenhouse gas emissions from energy, from deforestation, from agriculture, etc., through the development that many of us have enjoyed, is actually beginning to harm the earth and cause global warming. And the impacts of that are so significant that we haven't even begun to understand it, right? So, let me just use one example. I'll use two examples.
Okay.
The first is the rise in seawater levels, right? And you think it's the global temperature warms, Arctic ice melts, sea levels rise. Okay, so just think about a bath when you've got a couple of, I don't know, ducks in it, right? Ice cubes, it rises. Now you think it's only a little bit because it's really small amounts. We're saying it's something like I'm going to quote incorrectly now, but we're saying something like 8 centimeters, right? But actually, if you look at 80% of our planet is water, right? So if you look at that rise in sea level, particularly your coastal cities are already seeing significant erosion, significant greater flooding, harmful conditions. Secondly, because of the temperature changes, you talk about the health issues, right? So the growth of new bugs, basically, significant. Thirdly, drought, right? And drought, so if you have a look at the Sahel, right, not only through deforestation, but also through change in temperature, the desert is extending. And it's extending, kilometers every year. What happens to the people that were reliant on basically the flora at the intersection of the desert? Well, they have to start moving, right? When they start moving, they meet up with the farmers further down. What happens? Kaboom, right? So another area that people don't think about is that, quite frankly, greenhouse gases is causing acidification of the oceans, which is stopping the production of the biodiversity in the oceans. Okay? So overall, we call it the biggest threat facing mankind. Okay. Now, what happens when you step back from that? Well, I was involved in a couple of the Rio meetings trying to get governments to agree what on earth they're going to do about this. And it's really strange, right? Because this is how the rhetoric goes. Well, the problem was caused by the West and the East. And so, us developing nations need to be compensated for all the problems that you've caused so that we can adapt. And you mustn't hold us accountable for not mining coal, because we have to develop too.
Right.
So that's how the rhetoric goes. The great move forward that we all took was the Paris Agreement. Right? So the Paris Agreement in September 2015, which was about basically doing everything we can as a global economy to limit temperature rise, ideally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, there are many scientists, including one of my partners, Sir David King, who says that that's already gone. Right? If you have a look at, we actually haven't limited greenhouse gas emissions as a global community. So we've already missed it. And we should be focusing even more on adaptation mechanisms.
Yeah.
I don't know. All I know is that worrying about trying to fix things and trying to stop, I don't know, people investing in oil and coal is something that I guess some of us can do somewhere else. What I really try and think about, try and tell people is start thinking about what you can do, right? So the first thing I always say is understand the issue, right? Because it's so hard to understand the issue, but don't get paralyzed by it, because there's only so much you can do. Then think about, and I always use this very simple idea of, well, it's me, and then it's my community, my family, my community, and then it's where I work in my business, and then it's what I can do. And just once you understand what the issue is, think about how you can impact, right? Because this is such a big issue that actually it requires everyone to do what they can in their space. Sometimes it'll be about, I guess, managing your energy consumption. Sometimes it'll be about trying to make sure that your kids really understand what's going on. Sometimes it'll be about, I have noticed in following your feed that you have quite a strong Christian fellowship in this group. Mm. So if you have a look at what the Pope's talking about, I'm not saying you're Catholic, but if you have a look at really how the World Council of Churches has come together around this issue, starting these conversations, I think is really important, because actually all of us have to make the shift. Now, if I look at Ghana in particular, right, Ghana's economy is particularly exposed to the impact of climate change, because so many livelihoods depend on agriculture, and agriculture is poorly irrigated. So most agriculture in Ghana is rain-fed. That means when you have the significant variability in weather patterns, and I know you've recently experienced floods and you've had droughts in the north, a lot of this is all linked to this whole global warming issue. Can you do something about, I don't know, stopping China from doing, good luck, right? A lot of what my organization works on is working with those. But what one can do is say, okay, where I kind of goes, oh, guess what? There's a business opportunity. Water-fed irrigation. So there's some wonderful examples of drip irrigation that can really help solve the need for agriculture to respond without having to resort to some of the, significant, let's scale up farms, have these big things, which means people can't grow their food anymore. So, again, I just try and look for what potential opportunities there are to make whatever contribution you can make. The second area that Ghana is really exposed to is the fact that your road infrastructure is so poor. So when you have a variable weather pattern and you don't have paved roads and you don't have roads with good sides, etc., floods are going to disturb trade. So again, thinking, I don't know how many of you are in the road building business, but again, that is thinking, how do we shore up our infrastructure? And then, I was also really interested, so I didn't know enough about Ghana's electricity sector, but the fact that so much of it is hydropower, again, is really interesting, because hydropower is dependent on consistent water supply.
Right.
Right. So, when one has intermittent floods and droughts, you don't necessarily have a constant water supply. So, I think my recommendation about global warming is, first of all, it's real. Secondly, it's not easy to solve because it's a problem caused by everyone. Okay. Thirdly, don't get paralyzed by not knowing what to do about it. Just think about what on earth you can do where you are now.
Well, yeah, it's a global involvement in whatever we do in our communities and our neighborhoods. It's quite, and another thing too, I believe, is the fact that people take the communities in which we live in for granted. And the reason being because that's how life has been all these years. They don't see any difference that it's going to make, or they don't, the impact is so grand that I don't think people have actually got to grips with the thought of it.
No, and we don't connect it, you see. So we don't connect hurricanes, bushfires, floods, etc. to this. But that's where I would recommend, those of you that do like reading, just just do a really quickly understand what it means. And then from there, I think it is quite possible to just think about what you can do.
Yeah. I mean, that leads me to the next question, which is question 13, right? Counting the cost of climate change can be a challenge, since the social costs can be hard to calculate. It's another question from the panel, basically, and include the impact of human suffering. Can renewable energies be the answer to these challenges?
So yes, the cost of climate change is a huge challenge, and there are significant institutions, universities, global consultants, all trying to calculate the cost of climate change, which is fantastic. My personal view is that really what we need to do is to start acting. Okay, and I'll tell you more about that. So let me just start with renewable energy. So yes, renewable energy is indeed one of the key levers to address climate change. I put in, which I think will be posted, I put in some of my answer, a little pie chart on the contribution of various industry sectors to greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
And it's quite interesting. So 25% from electricity and heat production, 24% from land use change through deforestation, and that also is something that I think is quite relevant for Ghana. Okay. 24% from land use change, so that's deforestation, including unsustainable agricultural practices. So, even significant use of chemical fertilizer is part of a greenhouse gas emission issue. 21% from industry that uses fossil fuel energy and builds waste. 14% from transportation, 6% from buildings using fossil fuel for energy sources. So it's not as simple as saying, okay, let's put a few solar panels in and we've solved it, okay? But the idea that renewable energy can be part of what we call a transition solution for the energy sector is really critical. And I've also put in a link here. So one of the commissions that my business is involved in is the Energy Transitions Commission. I've put the web link in there. You can go and have a look. There's all sorts of interesting reports. Yeah. And really what that does is it talks about what is necessary to transition the economy, the energy system. And that means that you will have some large industrial segments that are going to have to still be driven for the foreseeable future by fossil fuel. But in some ways, that should be reserved for that, because we know at the moment we haven't figured out our solar panels can keep, I don't know, an aluminium smelter going, right?
Right.
But there's no reason cars should be driven by petrol, which is why you see the big hybrid and electric vehicle movement. There's no reason why buildings shouldn't use a mixed energy solution, right? So, you might need, there's lots going on around green buildings where you don't even have to air condition anymore, right? Because the way you design your buildings, in hot countries, the way you design your building actually uses natural flow of air.
Yeah, I saw that in Ghana, yeah.
So that's cool. And then energy efficiency. So how you just stop overusing energy. And then, of course, there is renewables. And this is the great win, I guess, of this decade, is that the cost of solar has come down so much. So it's actually become really affordable, right? And my great hope, so, if you can get the human race truly engaged around solving for things, it's amazing what we can do.
Yeah.
And so, the fact that solar, I think 15 years ago, everyone went, well, solar, but you know what, it's never going to scale, it's too expensive, blah, blah, blah. Well, now, solar has become pretty reasonable. And so now our biggest issue is how do you ensure that it gets to people? How can they have a grid linked to solar, et cetera, et cetera? And that's another thing, by the way, that we're looking at for the special economic zone in Nigeria, is how can one, the solar, you don't want to build a solar panel, right? Because China is producing it cheap, right? You want to bring it in, but what you do want to do is build the connection to the grid and put the assembly and the connection to the grid.
I've always wondered why. I mean, in Africa, we've got abundance of sunshine. So I'd always wondered, why can't our governments, get involved into bringing solar energy into Africa?
So there are examples of where that is beginning to happen, right? So, I mean, South Africa has a whole lot of solar. Well, partly because our systems have been used to running on fossil fuel or hydro, right? And so you keep it, and in many of our countries, the economy is driven by fossil fuel, but also the state utilities drive the economy. So it's not so easy to think about, I'm going to give up what I'm doing now and I'm going to invest in lots of solar, right? I think solar is, however, being seen as a significant opportunity to link, to provide energy to people who do not have a link into the grid and probably never will, because trying to get our infrastructure working isn't so easy. And secondly, a way to provide energy so that they can kind of switch on and off. And then thirdly, a lot of what we're talking about is how you can generate excess energy and feed it back to begin to limit some of the power outages that we have.
Oh.
What I one of the things that I often find again quite paralyzing, and we must watch the time, but one of the things I find quite paralyzing is thinking, well, the government should do this, the government should do that. It's not that, and it's not only in Africa, right?
Yeah.
So it's everywhere in the world. Governments can't agree amongst themselves anyway. So you think Africa's got a problem with power? The UK have got a problem with power, which is why it's increasingly expensive. So it might not be intermittent power, but we couldn't figure out whether we should have wind, whether we should have this, whether we should have it. And different governments came in changing different policies. So you had lots of wind farms go up, and they had subsidies. Then the subsidies went away, and they couldn't make any money.
For choice.
No, exactly. So so I definitely think that there is an opportunity. I haven't had a look at what Ghana's energy transition plans about. I do know that there are incentives in place for solar.
One of the big questions that came, which is in relation to what we just discussed, is, as we are determined to protect the planet from degradation through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing natural resources and taking urgent action on climate change, how can this be supported in Africa for the needs of the present and future generations, which is to do with our kids and our grandchildren and all that?
Okay. So look, this is where I guess I started thinking about, gosh, such a broad question, right?
It definitely is.
But this is where I start thinking about personal agency, right? So what on earth can I do wherever I am, right? Because I can use my vote, maybe, to vote for the people that are doing the right thing. If I can help my kids understand the importance of not creating food waste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm in business and I want to talk about really, I guess, my approach, or my business's approach to thinking about how business can begin to evolve themselves. So if you're in a business that has a business that economically is dependent on creating things that are wrong.
Yeah.
So, one of the big issues, I'm going to use the textiles business, okay? We all like clothes, we like buying lots of clothes, we like looking great, we go to church on a Sunday, we want a new shirt, it's all cool. The problem is, if you have a look at the textile industry in general, it can have some significant negative impacts, environmentally and socially, right? So environmentally, the negative impacts are around water, so significant use of water that could be used to grow food. Secondly, potentially significant negative impact on water, because there's a lot of dye that goes into water that then isn't always managed through the system. So, effluent that creates water problems. Thirdly, hazardous chemicals in the fabric creation business and the dyeing process, etc., which gets into our water tables and our land. And then waste. I mean, the amount of waste produced through all of the clothes we don't need, the clothes that are sewn that have little pieces extras. So, when you cut out a shirt, those little bits, they don't know what to do with them. So, I know that like 4,000 tons a month coming out of one factory, fabric waste. What happens with that?
Yes, that's
right?
true.
Goes into landfill, it just creates all sorts of issues. So what do we do about, and then there's social issues linked to it. So yes, it's great that people are sewing clothes, but very often they're not getting paid properly, etc. So when I talk to the textile industry, I say, think about how you can transform in 3 phases, right? First of all, think about how you can address the problems you have. And that is, make commitments to zero wastewater, zero hazardous, and fix what you've got going on in your business. Then secondly, think about how you can look at new opportunities using some of what you've created. So, one of the businesses I work with in the textile waste has actually been able to develop kind of offshoots to what the apparel business is, using some of the extras. So they actually generate revenue through that. Right. And then finally, think about if there are really new business opportunities coming from these problems, right? Because a problem flipped is an opportunity. So can you actually now provide a service to the textile industry because you've solved the problem yourself? And so you start monetizing something completely different. Can you use all of these tons and tons of waste to make a different product? And there are all sorts of interesting solutions out there, from chemical recycling of fabric to turning fabric into building materials, waste fabric into building materials. Wow, just imagine, you now not only make clothes, but you don't throw away any waste, and you turn it into a building material. The problem is you have to then think about how you sell that, because it's not going to be the same customer. But, so really thinking about phase 1, horizon 1, horizon 2, horizon 3 in a business, I think is a good idea. And then, as I said earlier, if you're a teacher, find out about this and take it to your kids, right? Why? Because kids are often much less hampered by the system that we're currently working in. And so they so often come up with solutions that are new and special and great. And that, you're struggling to look for a business idea, talk to your kids. They've probably got one for you.
It's true, actually.
So, and then, so I think just generally there's room for everyone to get involved. And the only thing I would say is, no one is coming. I mean, this is like, okay, well, the government's going to sort it out. No, the donors are going to sort it out. No one's going to come sort it out, because actually we have to sort things out ourselves. So I think that's where we can, that's why I agreed to come and speak to your group, because you look very proactive. And I thought, well, might just get a message out there to someone who's got a grand idea.
Yeah, yeah. One interesting question that we've had come from a member on the panel, and his name is Robert Wood. Is I agree with you that affordable housing, for instance, is key to delivering SDGs. But in Ghana, for instance, our major problem is the lack of use of our traditional materials in innovative ways to create affordable houses. The current trend of importation of building materials makes our housing stock very expensive indeed, either for purchase or to rent. For example, the use of materials in producing cement blocks and many others, etc. What are your thoughts on that, and how can it be tackled holistically?
Okay, great question. So in Ghana in particular, I'm not completely familiar with all of your potential feedstocks.
Yeah.
But, you know, I know that, so I was talking about this chap in Kigali who's basically helping smallholder farmers to plant trees that can then be used as building materials, right? His whole model is focused on that. He's got this grand idea that in the end, he's going to be basically the sustainable forestry producer to the whole building industry across Africa that will make sure that people have a good living out of it as well. I guess the issue with all of this is who controls the building material trade, right? So if you have kind of the large cement producers that all controlling that trade, that I think becomes a significant issue. What I've seen done in parts of the world, and you know, this is what's nice not having to represent a corporate now, right? What I've seen done in many parts of the world is this whole idea of local content. So regulations put in place that say, right, you know, you can build this thing, but I want you to prove to me that you have X% of local content. And that local content can't just be an imported raw material that comes in and you say it's local content because I'm selling it. No, it has to be local content that actually crowds in either local raw materials or local traders, and that, you know, I think begins to address this.
Are we talking about putting in things like embargoes here and there to restrict imports?
Well, look, I don't want to go as far as saying embargoes. So if you look at, I mean, in Nigeria, in all of their special economic zone, well, in fact, in a lot of what they do, they have a local content clause, right? That says, okay, you can come and do business here, but only if you have whatever percentage of local content. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but yeah, I know
it makes sense. Makes sense, a lot of sense, yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I would say is, Richard, I think one of the things to think about is, well, what is it that you could do to bring a solution to the building industry? So, you know, I was talking about this fabric waste issue. Now, the interesting thing about fabric waste and plastic waste, right, is that it can be turned into roof tiles and it can be turned into carpet underflooring. And you know, I think the capital investment required to do those sort of things is not that significant. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples on the web about how this works. So you know, I would encourage you to have a look at what some of the solutions are that are out there that aren't yet active in Ghana. And if you have this holistic picture of, right, you know, let us make sure that we have some kind of local content clauses in our building materials, then we crowd in solutions. I mean, I would also say, well, then let's create a special economic zone around affordable housing that can be properly governed and put the right incentives in place. You know, that all becomes really interesting, holistic solutions.
Oh, great. We had a long discussion yesterday in terms of the Ghana government's dealings with the IMF. that's why we mentioned IMF earlier, and I said we'll come back to that. I mean, this is not part of the questions that came from the panel, but my interest is what your views are on why would a country need to borrow from the IMF, for example?
Well, I mean, why would a country need to borrow from anyone?
Yes.
Okay, because they haven't got enough money.
Right. I mean, a lot of the reasons why people are a bit agitated, a bit upset, is the fact that we're looking at areas, business resources, natural resources that is in abundance in Africa. And so the idea is that with all these natural resources, we should be able to raise our own capital and be able to run our own businesses. That's why people are thinking, why in the first place should we go to the IMF?
Yeah. So look, I don't know the particular situation in Ghana, right? What I do know is that however emotional we feel about it, right? Most of our countries in Africa are considered high risk. Why are they considered high risk? Considered high risk because we generally have problems, right? So we have corruption, we have unstable governments, we have et cetera, right? And so, for anyone lending money, you ideally want to put your money, so whoever you are, you ideally want to put your money in the least risky place. Which is why there's always this big drama around when a country loses its status, its Moody's or S&P, whatever ranking status.
Yeah.
So my, and I don't know, I haven't looked into this, but my understanding why a country would need to go to IMF versus then raising its own capital is that it probably can't.
Right.
Right. So I think you would, really need to have a look at that. I mean, from what I can I see what people are saying about Ghana, bringing down the fiscal deficit, putting in place the right kind of policies, diversifying the economy, et cetera, is all really good. I don't know enough about the balance of payments. I don't know enough about how much money is available in the economy to spur growth. But I would imagine if I was, I guess it's like thinking about a company, right? If you think about Ghana as a company and the president as the CEO, and sitting there going, okay, now I need to spend money on doing all of these sort of things that I know longer term is going to drive growth, but I've got this amount of money. What do I do? Do I just hang in with what I've got now, or do I take debt? And I would imagine that's the thinking. Whether the IMF's good or going and raising capital from goodness knows whoever else is better, I don't really have a view.
Yeah. The last question, I'm very conscious of the time, is to do with the Chinese. Asian countries investing heavily in Africa. Why do you think this is happening now? Is it something that has been going on for a while?
20 years. Okay. Right. So look, again, I think this is a very emotional thing, right? So, I mean, it first started, the first argument was Chinese have ruined all of their land and they've got nowhere else to grow their food, so they're going to come and take over Africa so they can grow their food. And, we saw quite a lot of buying up of agricultural land, certainly in East Africa, around this. Then there was a thing, China's so overpopulated, it's got nowhere for its people, so it's going to send them all out here. Then there was the argument of China is now trying to move away from an industrialized economy because it's educated so many of its people and it wants to move to a high value added economy, but someone still needs to make the stuff and they can't afford to pay their highly educated workers, so they're going to come to Africa and use it as the industrial base. I don't know, right? I think at the end of the day, everyone's got, you know, we're all players on a field, right? And I'm not going to say, quite frankly, I'm not going to say which colonialist was the better, including, you know, including even within our own continents, right? What I will say is the big issues we have to have access to funding and expertise. And it's just not helpful for us as countries within Africa to either take cheap money and then give away our power or our whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Mustn't do that. Secondly, we need to make sure that whoever we invite in to do business does it in the right way.
Yeah.
Right? We can't possibly recreate what we had in the past. Right? And I use this example a lot, which is, you know, we are our own worst enemy, right? So we had companies coming in, taking all of our raw materials, leaving no value behind. We joined in a corruption dance, quite frankly, with many of, you know, the oil companies, the mining companies, etc. The only people that got rich were the companies and the politicians and a few crooked businessmen, local businessmen. Well, we can't let that happen with Chinese investment. So that's all I'd say. I don't think, I mean, I think in some ways, I think you'll find that many of the solutions that China is bringing to the world is a lot of what we need.
Yeah. I mean, if you look in your house that you live in, my house, for example, you find that if you take away, I've always been saying this using it as an example, if I take away most of the things that are made in China, you probably end up with almost an empty house. So that's how, basically, that's how industrious they become. And it's a good time to start being that industrious as well ourselves. So, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Gail, for your time. Good. Thank you so much for this session. It's been a very, very informative session. We enjoyed it so much. We're going to put a lot of the information online so the viewers can view and read and refer back to it. I thank you again for your time. Hopefully we'll get another session lined up at a later date so that we can catch up and continue if there's any more questions to come up. If there are any more questions, of course, you are with us on the forum, so hopefully we can get hold of you for the answers on those questions.
That's cool. Yeah, all right, yeah, my pleasure. Can I leave one message?
Yeah.
And that is, I always say that there are two thoughts that I carry with me all the time. Right. The first is one often used by Theodore Roosevelt and Mother Teresa, who says, "Do what we can with what we have, where we are now." And then I add something which is start, right? Because if we spend all our time moaning about everything, we're never going to get anything done, right? And the second is I was very fortunate to work a little on Nelson Mandela's agenda, you know, and he always said, nothing is possible until it happens, right? And so, you know, I really would encourage us, including I guess the honorables on the website chat, right? Really just think about what you can start doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gail.
Grand. My pleasure. All right. Have a good evening.
Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you for